Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to the Wild Vaughn Manor, where it's time to talk about my weekend reading report. It's my weekend reading report. Are y'all ready, Roger? Roger is all prepared for this weekend's reading report, which is mostly June on the Range, Western stuff. That's right, we're right smack dab in the middle of June on the Range. The fantastic, if I do say so myself, the fantastic BookTube reading event where we celebrate Westerns, and we're reading Westerns all month long. Still time to read a couple Westerns for June on the Range. So that's mostly what I read this week. I've been very, very busy, and next week is going to be even busier. My schedule, my videos for next week it's going to be a light week. I'll be lucky next week if I get 2 videos up. So it's going to be very unusual for me. So we'll see. Because the madness should only last 1 more week. And then things should return to normal. But we'll see. We'll see how it goes. So what did I read this past week? Well, I'll tell you. So I got a few books here to talk about for June on the Range and the things I read this past week. So I did all right well, actually it's the last 2 weeks, huh? It's the last 2 weeks. That's why I've got more than like 2 books here. It's because I didn't do my weekend reading report last week. That's right, I forgot about that. So what have I been reading the last couple weeks? And for my challenge, my 500 book challenge, the challenge where I have to read 500 books I own before I'll buy any new ones, I made a little progress. I always seem to make just a little progress. But I made a little. First book I finished was Flint, Louis L'Amour's Flint. And I couldn't remember whether I had read this one before when I picked it up. I didn't read this one before. And I knew it right away because this has an unusual setup. So Flint, that guy right there on the cover, Flint. At one time, he was an orphan who was looked after by an outlaw named Flint. And what? What are you yelling about, you mangy varmint? Hold up. You mangy jackrabbit coyote, what are you growling about? What you growling about? Just some folks trying to walk by in front of the manor. That's all. And you have to go yelping at them. Why don't you be well behaved for the rest of this video? That's how well behaved she's going to be. Well behaved, I said. Well behaved. Well behaved. We'll see. Where was I? Oh yes, Flint. So Flint, when he was just a youngin', was raised by an outlaw named Flint. But then Flint was murdered. And the kid went and slaughtered all the folks that murdered him. And it became a very famous gunfight. But then he left the West and went back east where he became super rich. So he became a super rich guy. But kind of unhappy because he married a terrible person who tried to have him killed. That was a pretty bad marriage. And then it turns out that he had a terminal illness. So he had, he didn't have much time left, Flint. So he decided to go back to the West that he knew when he was young, go back to Flint's old hideout, take the name of Flint for his final days so he could, forget the name he had been living under as a rich guy and just kind of die alone. But, that's not how it happens in Louis L'Amour books. He has to do some heroic stuff and get involved in somebody else's trouble. And so it was an interesting setup and a really good book. So this one was really, really good. And this, for my 500 book challenge, was number 52. Yes, this is number 52. So this is 52, Flint. Then I read this. This is To Be a Man by William Deckard. To Be a Man by William Deckard. So this is an interesting book. It's not what I expected it to be. So I expected this to be more of a traditional Western. If you read the back of the book, it sounds like it's going to be more of a traditional Western. This is the back of the book. Too little grass, too many cattle. Roscoe Banks left his uncle's ranch when he was 16. He wanted to be a top hand just like his father was. His father, whose killers were out there, somewhere. And while he went cowboying in the wide country between the Rockies and the Pacific, Texas and Montana, he might just find them. And by the time he was through, he had done it all across the whole American West, from his first ride alone to the blazing shootout at the end. So that makes it sound like this is going to be a traditional Western. It's not a traditional Western like at all. At all. It has no interest in being a traditional Western. So when it started out, I thought, you know what, this kid, his father died, he's going to grow up, hunt down his father's killers, and, you know, get revenge. And it's not about that at all. So what this actually is, this is one of the 2 novels that William Decker wrote. And William Decker seems like he was an interesting fella. He was an editor, a book editor in New York, but he also worked on a ranch, and he knew all about being a cowboy because he was a cowboy before he became an editor. An interesting couple of jobs for this guy, but you can tell when you read this that all of the cowboy stuff in here is really authentic. This guy knew what he was talking about when it comes to being a cowboy. And that's what this story is about. This story is about a guy who spends his whole life being a cowboy, going from one ranch to another and living this cowboy life. He never I'm just going to spoil this one because you probably will never read this because this book's kind of hard to find, but he never finds his father's killers. He doesn't even try to look for his father's killers because that's not what this book is about. It's not a traditional Western like you would expect. And this takes place at the end of the West. So a lot of this takes place in the 20th century, which is interesting. So, you know, it's not the traditional Western setting. This is about being a cowboy and then growing old as a cowboy in the 20th century and how the life that he was living was changing. Being a cowboy was changing as modern ranches changed. And the whole business that he was in changed dramatically. And it's just his life story. So that's what this is. And as a book, it's good. It's a really good book. However, as a novel, it did leave a little bit to be desired, I think, because it was basically one anecdote in this guy's life after the other. So one little story about Roscoe at this ranch, and then there'll be months that pass, and then there's this other story about Roscoe at a different ranch, or months will pass again, and then Roscoe is, you know, in a rodeo, and so it's that kind of thing. It's not a novel telling one particular story with a plot. Really, this is entirely different. So it's good. I'm glad I read it. It was just definitely an unusual change for June on the Range, that's for sure. So after that, I switched to something that wasn't June on the Range at all. Then I read this. I read Adventures on Other Planets, edited by Donald A. Wollheim. And this was fantastic. This is wonderful. So this is just a little book of, what is it, 5 kind of longish science fiction stories? Yeah, 5 of them. One of them was Ogre by Clifford D. Samac, which was great. And this also has The Rull by A.E. Van Vogt, which is fantastic. All of the stories were in this were really good. And so this is for my vintage science fiction project. My goal to read every vintage science fiction book I own before I die, which is pretty much impossible. unless I live forever, but I'm going to try to live forever. Like I said, Rogers, says he'll help me out when it comes to that. You'll help me out, becoming undead when the time comes so I can continue to read my vintage science fiction books. It'll be great. And that way, June on the Range could keep happening, forever and ever and ever. I'll be a rotting corpse, but I'll be animated by, supernatural means. So that'll be great. It'll be awesome. It won't be creepy at all. So anyway, Adventures on Other Planets. This was an awesome vintage science fiction book. I 5 stars. If I were to rate books with stars, this would have 5. And so there you go. It only costs 35 cents. It doesn't cost 35 cents anymore. This was published when? 1955? Was it? Yes, 1955. This is the third printing, though. This is the third printing from 1961. Most of the stories are from the 40s or the early 50s. So there you go. It's awesome. It's just as awesome as that cover. So this is the one thing I read the last couple weeks that was not, well, other than comic books, that was not for June on the Range. But then I read the book that is probably going to be the best thing I read for June on the Range. And this book was sent to me by Dave and Olive at Book Blather. This is Arrow in the Dust by L.L. Foreman, and this book is fantastic. This is just great. Arrow in the Dust by L.L. Foreman. About this fella who is a deserter who through a set of circumstances is impersonating a general that he knew who died at the beginning of this book. And it's not a book, I mean, it has a lot of the stuff that would be problematic today. Has Native Americans, or of course, as they're called in this book, Indians, who are trying to wipe out a wagon train. As it turns out, they actually have a pretty good motivation for doing this. I mean, once you find out why they're going after this wagon train, you're like, oh, okay, I understand why they'd be going after this wagon train. There's a mystery in this book about why they're doing this. And this guy, he pretends to be this general. He takes the part of this general who just died so that he can take command of some soldiers that are trying to get this wagon train through, because the soldier in command, nobody respects him, And so he's afraid, our hero, who's really a gambler and, a shiftless gunfighter. He wants to keep this wagon train, from getting slaughtered, though. So he takes command, because for some reason, he just knows all the right things to do as a general. Who knows? So there are some things that aren't so realistic in this book, but the action in this book is great. I mean, just spectacular. Pacing is fantastic. Characters are wonderful. This is a great book. Arrow in the Dust by L.L. Foreman. I don't think there are too many copies of this floating around. They did make a movie off of this, but it was way back in the olden days. So you'd be kind of lucky to find a copy of this. But it's a really good book. I do highly, highly recommend it. So there's that. And then now I'm up to book 55. I'm reading for my 500 book challenge, my 55th book. And that would be this one, Trevanian's Incident at 20 Mile. And this was sent to me very kindly. This was sent to me by Troy Tradup, who greatly admired this book and wanted me to read it. And so I'm reading it because it is a Western. You'd never guess from this completely stupid cover. This cover is terrible and lazy. I hate lazy, stupid covers like this. It's a tree. Gives you no idea about what this book is about. But I'll stop complaining because I complained the last time I showed you this book. I'll shut up now about its crappy cover that is just a tree. Anyway, Incident at 20 Mile by Trevanian. I just started it. I'm only on page 42, and the book is 340 pages? Yeah, 340 pages long, so I got a bit to read in this book. So far, it's an entertaining book, and it's going to be a good book. It's well written. A lot of humor in this book. And it's one of those modern Westerns that kind of demystify the West, you know. I will see how it goes. I like it. But it's hard to take seriously. It's sort of written like, in a way, it reminds me of Lonesome Dove in that it has that kind of light narration at the beginning of the book, which kind of makes you think that the whole thing is going to be kind of like that. Lonesome Dove was not. Lonesome Dove actually turned serious. And while it kept that kind of narrative style, I'm not sure this will. Hey! But we'll see. This could be fantastic. We'll see. We'll see. I'm not 100% convinced it will be, but we'll see. I'm reading that. So, those are the books. I also finished a couple comic books for my World's Finest Challenge, where I read Superman and Batman every day of my life. You know, I read the greatest Superman stories ever told. And for Epic Comic Book Wednesday, I did a video on that. Steve Donahue did as well. I also read the greatest Batman stories ever told. So Steve and I will probably be doing a video on this sometime in the future. And now I'm reading a couple other things for the World's Finest Challenge, where I read Superman and Batman every day. One of those things is Public Enemies, which is Superman, Batman, Public Enemies by Jeff Loeb and Ed McGuinness and Dexter Vines. And I read this years and years and years ago, but it's great. I really like the art style in this book. It's really cool. It's really cool. I don't know why this series wasn't called World's Finest. It should have been. There's Superman, there's Batman. It should have been called World's Finest because that's what this is, really. But it's not. It's called Superman Batman. And this is the first of that series. I think I've got the whole run of this, I think. I'll double check on that. But yeah, this is the first one, and I haven't read this in forever. So there's that, and I'm also reading the 4th volume of The Man of Steel. This was the revamp, John Byrne's revamp of Superman from the 80s. And this is the end of his run, as well as the other creators who were working on the Superman comics at the time. This is volume 4 of Superman the Man of Steel, the last volume in this set. And yeah, it's going to be cool. I have to say, I really like John Byrne's art, and there's some other really cool artists in here. Mike Mignola is in this book. This was towards the end of John Byrne's run, so there's a bunch of other artists also who are in this book, including Jerry Ordway, who I like an awful lot. So yeah, there's that. I'm reading that right now. I only got one thing in the mail this week, and that would be a comic book, which I got with BookTube at War in mind. BookTube at War, which is an event starting next month, which is all about reading fiction or nonfiction about war. And this is a comic book. This is Showcase Presents Enemy Ace. And this is a dynamite series. This has art not only by Joe Kubert, who does most of the art in this, but it also has a bunch of other great artists. It has John Severn in here, has Howard Chaykin, Frank Thorne, Neil Adams is in this, so a bunch of great artists. It is the Showcase Presents series, so it's all in black and white. But Enemy Ace is about, well, an enemy ace during World War I. One of the best war comics probably ever. I often cite Sergeant Rock as being the greatest war comic ever, but this comes awful close. This comes awful close. So I'm going to read Sergeant Rock and this again for BookTube at War. We'll see which one I like better. I remember this being pretty fantastic. So Enemy Ace. That's the only thing I got this week. I guess that's all I have to say this week. I'll see you next time, whenever that is. This, like I said, this week is going to be tricky. I do have a TBR for BookTube at War that I'm going to try to get up. I haven't filmed it yet, but I know what it's going to be. I don't know when that video will be up. I don't know if I'll be able to get Epic Comic Book Wednesday up. It's just this coming week is... Don't expect to see me much, unfortunately. The following week should be back to normal. I should be back to normal after that, but I might be pretty scarce on BookTube for this coming week, so we'll see. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.